Okay, well, we have one more talk. Today it's Harold Cohen, who won the Distinguished Artist Award for Lifetime Achievement in Digital Art. The term for the Art Awards chair is 3 years. We honored Jean-Pierre Hébert, Manfred Moore, and now we're honoring Harold. And part of that is to research all the people that are nominated and get the jury to finally come to an agreement of who is the person that is deserving. And Harold certainly is. So rather than extend my introduction, I think we'd like to hear some gems from Harold Cohen.
I started work on the Aaron program something like 43 years ago when I was a guest scholar at the AI lab at Stanford. I've written many times that I called it Aaron because I thought at that point that I would be writing a lot of programs and I might as well start at the beginning of the alphabet and leave room for all the rest. And then some 6 months later, I realized that in fact Aaron is my own Hebrew given name, and that I had inadvertently proclaimed this program to be my personal surrogate. And the result, of course, was that I never did write another program. Aaron is the only program I've ever worked on. I've also written often about my fascination at that time with the biblical story of Moses and Aaron. It's not hard to see why Aaron's programmer would find it fascinating, given that Aaron is the giver of laws and Aaron is the high priest, the performance artist, so to speak, and sometimes sculptor, charged with ritualizing those laws on behalf of the community. But it was only about a month ago when I had occasion to review the work I've done over the last 40 years that I started to recognize the significance to me of the rest of the biblical story, in which you will recall the Hebrews spend 40 years in the desert before reaching their promised land. Unrolling canvases I hadn't seen since I painted them proved to be a much more troubling experience, both intellectually and emotionally, than I would have thought possible. For one thing, it seemed to me that the very early work looked uncomfortably like my most recent work. Were the similarities merely superficial, or did they reflect some fundamental and evidently unchanging attitudes about what a painting is? Whatever. Justified or not, I found it hard to shake off the sense that I didn't have much progress to show for my 40 years of work. Then there was the question of what I'd actually been doing during those 40 years, because if there really was a relatively short, straight path from the early 70s to the present day, it looked as if I'd spent very little time and effort walking on it. Why, for example, had I spent a decade teaching it human anatomy so that it could make imaginary portraits? What did building machines have to do with getting from then to now? Before all this started, I'd never set foot inside a machine shop and had so little interest in engineering, so little understanding, I didn't even know when I started that one could buy machine parts, gears and belts and stuff like that from catalogues. Why had I thought it necessary to spend a couple of decades building a series of drawing machines and painting machines? Was I simply wasting time on these apparently peripheral projects when I could have been marching straight towards my own promised land, as presumably the Hebrews did? Well, no, actually they didn't. Well, one of the most interesting aspects of the biblical story is that the distance from Cairo to Jerusalem is all of about 250 miles. They could have covered it in a year if they just ambled along at 5 miles a week. Evidently, the biblical story is not one of traveling it's a story of becoming, the record of a change of state rather than a change of place. At the beginning of the story, the Hebrews were not much beyond idolatry, hence Aaron's sculptural efforts with the famous golden calf. And it took 40 years for them to become the people to whom the promised land had been promised. Well, that's a powerful metaphor, and I'd like to think that my own 40 years have made me more worthy of my own promised land, were I ever to get there. But what is it? Where is it? Like any other creative artist, I'd like to think it's just over the next hill from where I am right now. But of course it never is. There's always another hill. There never was a direct path on which I could have covered my own 250 miles in a year. It's tempting, being here today in this community, to suppose that today's high-tech world is in fact a sort of promised land, or at least the last till before we get there. I'm not sure I belong in this world, this particular world. As I said this morning, my own daughter regards me as a techno-peasant. But if I do belong here, it's because I spent one complete night, one entire night, shortly arriving in San Diego from London, wrestling with an angel. In this case, a rather ugly angel that had taken the form of a Fortran manual. I think I won because by the following morning, I thought I was seeing the glimmerings of what programming would then become for me. Not so much an obviously powerful set of tools. All of my contemporaries saw that it was a powerful set of tools. But a sort of second cognitive system, a second place from which to view the world. And with that mental set about programming is still for me today the only technology that has been profoundly and centrally important in my work. Well, in that case, how do I explain the years that went into building machines? Well, perhaps it was just a techno-peasant doing his best to survive. But it doesn't require much of an explanation if you think about the state of computing in 1970. My own first feeble little Fortran programs were punched on IBM cards and fed through a hole to a dance hall-sized installation kept behind locked doors, what was known as the university's central computer. The first computer I could call my own was a Nova, one of the first so-called mini-computers. It had all of 8K of memory, and I don't remember now whether that was 8K bits or 8K bytes. I know it wasn't 8K words. And it used paper tape for mass storage. I wasn't smart enough to program in machine code, which all of the hackers were doing when they wrote Star Wars every time they got a machine. So I had to load BASIC and then my programs off paper tape every time I switched the machine on. I talked to it through a state-of-the-art monitor, a Tektronix, which is a hefty freestanding module that weighed about 40 or 50 pounds, with a flickering green display about the size of a picture postcard. Well, that's not very promising. What museum director or gallery director in his right mind would devote an exhibition to something happening on a screen the size of a picture postcard? What could have been more obvious for me then than the need to build something that could be seen by more than one person at a time? But wait, there was nothing in my discovery of programming that implied a need to exhibit. Of course not. That wasn't programming, that was me. And I mean the simple me in that simple assertion to denote the sprawling amalgam of personal history, cultural ambience, understanding, knowledge, ambition, tastes, all of the multitude of elements that make me different from every one of you different from each other. Learning to program didn't wipe the slate of me clean, but in providing a new way of looking at the world, it did effect critical changes. And every subsequent act was then driven and fashioned by the then current state of me, designed, whatever material result it may have produced, with the expectation that feedback from the act would affect further critical change. In short, going long past my own work into a general sense of the way things are, I don't think we should ever view creative behavior as the production of a stream of objects, paintings, drawings, machine paintings, painting machines, but as a continuous feedback-driven loop of self-modification. Whatever else may be involved, and there will be, the desire for prestige, money, whatever. We make art in order to grow. We grow in order to make art. The strategies which the artist adopts to produce his work may frequently do seem remarkable, inexplicable to the outside world, which has no way of knowing how they came about. To the artist himself, they may seem to result from nothing more remarkable than pragmatic problem solving, as was my decision to build machines, for example, so that people could see what was going on. What all this implies is that I should be able to give a better picture of my 40 years in the desert from the conditions that gave rise to the things I chose to do than from a history of the things themselves. Why, for example, did I find myself wrestling with the Fortran manual in 1968? Well, the paintings that I did for the Venice Biennale in 1966 arose from the notion that if I could write the rules for making art, then making art then all one would need to make art would be to play out the rules. So evidently my head was in the right place to recognize 2 years later that the computer might be the ideal machine for playing out those rules. And if that were the case, it was equally obvious that I would need to be in control of that machine. 10 years after that, I would have said, look, the program is doing this on its own. And in making that statement, I would be demanding of myself that I provide a way of showing the machine in action so that people could see it in action. Another 10 years on, and I would have said, the fact that the program is doing this on its own is the central issue here, denoting my belief in the program's potential and growing autonomy over the whole business of art making. But the truth is that while Aaron was gaining independent control, I've lost it. There we go. While Aaron was gaining independent control over an increasingly complex set of strategies, it wasn't actually becoming any more autonomous at all. How is that possible? It was producing complex images of a high quality, and I could have had it go on forever without rewriting a single line of code. How much more autonomous than that can one get? Well, of course, that's exactly the point. It's virtually impossible to imagine a human being in a similar position. The human artist is modified in the act of making art. For the program to have been similarly self-modifying would have required not merely that it be capable of assessing its own output, but that it had its own modifiable worldview to provide a basis for any meaningful assessment. Now, can a computer program ever acquire autonomy in that human sense? No, I don't pretend to know. But eventually it became clear to me that the most complex computer program in existence is so many orders of magnitude less complex than the mind of a human being. Perhaps especially the human mind engaged in making art or literature. That it wasn't going to happen in my lifetime. It certainly wasn't going to happen with Aaron. Well, that realization clarified a lot of things for me, but you may be surprised to know that it did not render Aaron irrelevant. After all, how much did it really matter that it couldn't make art on its own? Apparently, I couldn't make art on my own either. It had been 40 years since I'd made art without Aaron's participation. It's true that I could do things that Aaron couldn't, but then Aaron could do things that I couldn't. The real artist, the real agent behind all of this accumulated work was the combination of myself and the program. Or no, let me be more accurate. It was the interaction of two modes of seeing the world, two cognitive systems, the one that had developed through a long life as a system for making art, and one that had developed through half of that life as a system for constructing and maintaining the Aaron program. So now, and by now I do mean the last weeks and months, if one was no longer to be the teacher pushing the other towards autonomy, what would be the most productive form the relationship could take? And what did my wife do with the last page? It's here. Well, I'll have to make it up, won't I? All right, see, I found it. You know, when I was teaching, I used to be able to talk for 2 hours without notes and without any preparation. And the moment I stopped teaching, I found I couldn't utter a coherent sentence unless I had it written down. So there you are, I'm a casualty of being an emeritus professor. So the question was, what is the appropriate form for the relationship between myself and program? And how do we arrive at that form? How do we make it happen? Well, I thought the first thing was to establish a set of minimum conditions from which to move forward. I wanted the simplest of drawings, and by simple now, I mean drawings unencumbered by obvious intentionality, to which I could then respond with the simplest of color. And by that I mean color unencumbered by the physical, technological complexity of paint. The last finished works I did in the old mode, so to speak, rested upon printing Aaron's drawings on canvas, one of which you see to the right here, allowing me to work on them in my own space. But this time I thought I wanted a kind of intimacy with the program, a much greater intimacy that I thought I could only hope to get by my working in Aaron's space. It's always heartening, rather like a good omen, when things fall into place at the right time. The way computing technology has always seemed to come up with what I needed, just exactly when I needed it. Decent color monitors when I needed to work on color, for example. So I wasn't entirely surprised a few weeks ago when I told my Lisp guru at Fronts Incorporated that I was thinking about using one of the new touch screens to do finger painting. And he responded that he had just finished a Lisp interface to the Windows Touch system. Well, there you are. It's got to work. Well, my assistant and I installed this new system, which you see here, just a week ago. So believe me, it will be a long time before any finished artwork comes up that I can show you. But given the choice between ending this talk with a glimpse into an as yet undefined future and ending it by winding up a settled past, well, that's a no-brainer, isn't it? Here it is then, my own next hill, my own new beginning, which I'll call finger painting for the 21st century, as recorded here last Thursday. Thank you.